There's a good chance you've never heard of Mart Duggan. Most people haven't, including history buffs. But for a brief period in the 1870s, Dugan served as the lone vestige of law and order in the violent boomtown of Leadville, Colorado. Originally from Ireland, Dugan got to start out west prospecting for gold. Quickly garnered a deadly reputation, and by the time he got to Leadville, he had a total of 7 notches already on his gun. And when the town marshal was shot dead in April of 1878, it was Dugan who took his spot. You know those old tropes in westerns where the sheriff or marshal holds off an entire mob of vigilantes all on their own? Well, Dugan actually did just that very thing. Not once, but twice. This guy just did not know the meaning of the word fear. Only problem was he couldn't seem to adjust to an ever-changing landscape. As the West became more and more civilized, Dugan failed to adapt. And it was this failure, along with his somewhat heavy-handed tactics, that would ultimately lead to an early grave. So without further ado, let's dive into the life and death of Leadville Marshal Mart Duggan. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Martin J. Dugan was born in Ireland on November 10, 1847. His parents would migrate to the United States when he was still a child. Spent a few years in the Irish slums of New York City before heading west, first in Nebraska and then Colorado. I'm not entirely sure where they initially settled in Colorado, but by the year 1870, they were farming just outside of Denver. You can actually find a 23-year-old Martin on that year's census, still living there at the farm with his parents and siblings. Now, real quick, let me just go ahead and toss out my usual disclaimer. There's just not a lot of information out there regarding Dugan's early life. And what little I was able to find is either patently false or just unverifiable. For instance, legend has it that he fled New York City after the draft riots of 1863. But we know that's not true because his family was already living in Nebraska by 1859. Oh, hang on a second, I need to blink real quick. If you don't mind, I'm going to try to take a little break about every 2 minutes or so and visibly blink on camera. There's a lot of concerned viewers on YouTube thinking maybe that I don't blink enough, so I don't want anyone to worry. My eyes are sufficiently hydrated, okay? And I will try to blink more often. Now, there's another story about Mart and one of his brothers being captured by the Lakota during that same period. Hell, Dugan even supposedly fought against Red Cloud up in Montana when he was driving freight. I've read that he was a Bronco buster in Salt Lake City and even a performer in a variety act. Truth is, we don't really know what Dugan was up to in the early 1870s. We don't even know for sure when he first left home. Thankfully, though, by 1875, things do begin to clear up. He spent that summer penning for gold on the outskirts of Georgetown, Colorado. And later on that winter, he got a job in Georgetown proper as a dance hall bouncer. Say what you will about Dugan, but as head bouncer, the man most definitely ran a tight ship. He basically just had 3 simple rules. Number 1, never underestimate your opponent. Expect the unexpected. Number 2, take it outside. Never start anything inside the dance hall unless it's absolutely necessary. And 3, be nice. If someone gets in your face and calls you a cocksucker, Dugan wanted you to be nice. Ask the man to walk, but be nice about it. If you won't walk, walk him, but be nice. And if you can't walk him, one of the other bouncers or maybe even a bartender will help you, and you'll both be nice. And no, that's not actually what Dugan said. That's Patrick Swayze from the movie Roadhouse. The rest was true, though. Dugan did spend the summer of 1875 prospecting, and he did indeed take a job as a bouncer over in Georgetown's Occidental Dance Hall and Saloon. In fact, it's right there at the Occidental where he made his bones as a gunfighter. You see, one evening, a patron got a little too drunk and decided to shoot out all the interior lights in the saloon. Luckily, Dugan was on hand and able to grab the man's revolver, which he then used to deliver a thorough ass-whooping. The drunk, battered but still defiant, told Dugan that he didn't think he'd do so well in a stand-up gunfight. And Dugan replied by tossing the bloody revolver across the room and marching outside. He then stopped on the opposite side of the street, turned around, and waited. Sure enough, here comes the drunk just a few moments later, pistol in hand. But like I said, Dugan was waiting. He likewise cleared leather and managed to drill his opponent straight through the heart. A minor's court was convened, but all present declared that the killing was justifiable. Once again, we don't really know what Dugan was up to for the remainder of that year, but by 1878, he was residing in the bustling boomtown of Leadville. Now, Leadville was still very new in 1878. But by 1879, its population had skyrocketed to around 18,000. There were 19 hotels, 38 restaurants, 3 undertakers, 82 saloons, 35 whorehouses, and nearly 24 gambling joints. And if you caught my recent episode on Dallas Studemeyer, Leadville was experiencing the same exact problem as El Paso when it came to finding a suitable town marshal. The first man to pin on the badge was T.H. Harrison. He'd only last a total of 2 days before being beaten and chased out of town. Skip ahead to the following month, and Harrison's successor, an old boy by the name of George O'Connor, was shot dead by one of his own deputies, a deputy who just so happened to be aligned with Leadville's criminal element. So, with no other choice, the mayor and city council turned to our very own Mart Duggan. Turns out that gunfight back in Georgetown was reported in newspapers as far away as Chicago. And by the time Dugan arrived there in Leadville, he had already killed an additional 6 men. Allegedly. Like I said earlier, we don't really know for sure what he had been up to. Also, there was another Dugan in that same area, like a decade prior, who killed several prospectors before being strung up by a lynch mob. So it's thought that maybe he and our Dugan are sometimes sort of mixed up. Either way, like I said, by the time he arrived there in Leadville, he did have a rather rough reputation. And it's this reputation that ultimately got him appointed as Marshal, much to the chagrin of all the local ne'er-do-wells. The last thing they wanted was someone like Dugan stepping in and ruining all their fun. Matter of fact, no sooner had he pinned on the badge than he received an anonymous note telling him to get the hell out of town. Oh, gotta blink. Dugan would later tell a reporter, quote, "Immediately after I was appointed Marshal, I received a written notice from the roughs to leave town. And if I stayed for 24 hours, I would follow George O'Connor. I paid no attention to the notice, but took every precaution to always be on guard." Dugan also noted that the town was not only full of thieves, thugs, and desperate characters, but there were some quarrelsome miners determined that no newcomer should have authority over them. And yeah, it wasn't too long before these so-called quarrelsome miners and desperate characters began to test him. On one night in particular, they started getting rowdy inside a saloon and tearing up all the furniture. Dugan arrived, alone, identified the leader, and ordered him to step outside. When the man asked what would happen if he refused to go, Dugan told him to, quote, "Say a Hail Mary, because you're a dead man where you stand." Legend has it that the saloon fell as silent as a mouse fart and that the troublemaker dutifully obeyed. And it wasn't just the hardened criminals who faced Dugan's wrath. This guy really was a stickler when it came to doing things his way. He'd fire his own deputies at the drop of a hat for even the slightest of infractions. And if they refused to do as they were told, he'd deal out justice with a good old-fashioned pistol whipping. Even his own boss, the mayor, wasn't safe. I guess at one point he locked up one of the mayor's wealthy friends, and when the mayor complained, Dugan threatened to throw his ass behind bars as well. Hell, he even fired a municipal magistrate for being too soft on crime. When the judge asked by what authority a mere city marshal had to oust a judge, Dugan pulled out his revolver, stuck it under the magistrate's nose, and marched him out of his office. So yeah, I think it's safe to say that Marshal Dugan wasn't all that easily intimidated. His courage was really put on display one evening when a large group of vigilantes showed up at the jail looking to lynch one of his prisoners. Dugan would later recall, quote, "I started out alone to get ahead of the mob. I stood out in the middle of the street with a cocked revolver in each hand and told them I would kill the first man who attempted to pass. I managed to make them understand that some of them were sure to be killed if they persisted. And from that time on, they understood that I would not do to fool with." End of quote, and hell yeah, brother. This scene would be repeated not long thereafter when a guy named Jim Bush shot and killed an unarmed man. Vigilantes once again came calling, looking to throw a necktie party, but Dugan held them off long enough for Bush to be transported to Denver under heavy guard. So yeah, all in all, not a bad showing by Marshal Dugan. Oh, 1 second. Gotta blink. Only problem was he seemed to have the same affliction we spoke of a couple of weeks ago regarding Dallas Studemeyer. And that affliction was a strong fondness for hard liquor. When Dugan was sober, he was said to be well-mannered and soft-spoken. But once he started drinking is when things took a turn for the worse. According to a local paper, quote, "Under the influence of liquor, he, Dugan, was the incarnation of deviltry and had as little regard for human life as a wild beast." And to paraphrase Leadville historian George Wilson, Dugan swaggered about town, eager for a challenge. Quick with both fist and gun, he terrorized innocent and guilty alike, boldly hunting out the most bloodthirsty desperados to force a duel, and just as boldly assaulting innocent citizens on any or no provocation. But for all of his brutality and lawlessness, he was considered absolutely fearless, as well as being the only man in camp able to intimidate the various roughs and cutthroats. End of quote. So yeah, I don't think anyone doubted Dugan's courage. But still, you can't just be walking around all willy-nilly and threatening civilians, especially when you're the damn marshal. And when Dugan got drunk and severely beat a bartender, brandishing his sidearm while doing so, the city council finally got fed up and took his badge. Temporarily. Turns out it ain't much of a crime whacking a surly bartender. And besides, the victim ended up withdrawing his charges, so the city council just reinstated Dugan as if nothing ever happened. And honestly, from what I can tell, despite these periodic drunken outbursts, Dugan really was pretty good at keeping the peace. That being the case, the city council did offer to reappoint him as Marshal when his term came to an end in April of 1879. Dugan declined, though, and instead he took an extended trip with his wife to Michigan. And sure enough, without him around, crime once again shot through the roof there in Leadville. And just to give you an idea how bad things got that summer, a newspaper would report that there is a general feeling that every man must be his own bodyguard and be prepared to shoot down anyone who attempts to invade his personal or property rights. And that, quote, bunkos positively, unequivocally, and without the least reservation of mind or matter, have things their own way in Leadville. Footpads may rob a man in broad daylight on the most public of streets, and there is no civil power in Colorado that can give the robbed redress. End of quote. Bunko, of course, is just another way of saying con man. And footpads, if I'm not mistaken, or your run-of-the-mill pickpockets or thieves. Oh, gotta blink. Now, things finally came to a head in late November when vigilantes stormed the jail and lynched a couple of the prisoners, something that would have never happened under Dugan's watch. They then placed a placard around one of their victims' necks that read, quote, notice to all thieves, bunko steerers, footpads, and chronic bondsmen for the same, and sympathizers for the above class of criminals. This is our commencement, and this shall be your fates. We mean business, and let this be your warning. End of quote. It was signed Vigilantes Committee, and followed by the phrase, we are 700 strong. So in turn, the criminals also began mobilizing. They claimed to outnumber the vigilantes, and said that they not only knew all of their names, but they were going to hang each and every single one of them. And then when they were done with that, they would burn Leadville to the ground. So yeah, things were really falling apart without Dugan. Finally, the city's founders located him up there in Michigan and begged for him to return. According to Dugan, quote, the city council telegraphed me at Flint, Michigan, asking me to come back at once and take the marshalship as they did not believe anyone else could prevent the roughs from running the town. I came back at once. And yeah, just like before, Dugan hit the ground running. He fired the entire police force, and then, to quote historian Robert D. Arment, set about cracking heads and arresting thugs. How Dugan even apprehended such notables as Big Ed Burns and Billy Thompson, brother of the famous Texas gunfighter Ben Thompson. And once his term was officially complete in April of 1880, he once again refused reappointment, opting instead to open a livery stable. He was still ready to throw down, though, if need be, and he never did seem to be too far from the action. Case in point, later on that spring, there was a big strike at one of the nearby mines. The owners rejected the prospectors' demands and began raising an army of hard cases to squash the rebellion. Things got so tense that the governor had to send in the state militia. The only problem was the bulk of the militiamen were sympathetic to the miners. There were even rumors that the prospectors and the militia were planning on joining forces and attacking the bosses. Finally, the militia's own commander, General Cook, had to call in a local Leadville militia known as the Tabor Tigers, an outfit comprised mostly of gamblers, bartenders, and at least one livery owner by the name of Mart Duggan. Matter of fact, Dugan was the militia's second in command. He and his men did as ordered, arresting over 200 people and helping to bring about a peaceful resolution. Now, despite taking such a proactive role in local affairs, Dugan still remained just as quarrelsome as ever, especially when he was full of that drink. In late November of 1880, he was delivering a fancy sleigh to a house of ill repute when a guy named Lewis Lamb stepped out in front of him. Damn near got himself ran over. Apparently, these two guys had butted heads previously, so this latest interaction quickly led to an exchange of what I can only assume were some not-so-polite words. Gotta blink. Lamb ended up turning and walking away, but Dugan followed, just pretty much calling him everything but a son of God. By the time they reached the whorehouse, Lamb had had enough. He demanded that Dugan apologize. And when the former marshal told him to go to hell, is when Lamb reached for his pistol. Big mistake. Dugan may have been an asshole, but he was still pretty quick on the draw. In one fluid motion, he jumped off the sleigh and put a bullet straight in Lamb's mouth, killing him instantly. Now, despite Dugan being cleared on grounds of self-defense, not everyone was on his side. Turns out Lamb was a rather popular guy, and as a result, Dugan's livery stable began losing business. To make matters worse, Lamb's wife swore that she'd continue wearing her quote-unquote widow's weeds long enough to dance on Dugan's grave. Finally, when the stable went belly up, Dugan was forced to sell his home and move to a nearby mining camp known as Douglas City. It's there where he found work as a deputy sheriff. And despite the West becoming more and more civilized with each new day, Dugan remained just as rough as ever. Like the time in 1887 when several soiled doves were conned into buying some fake jewelry by a traveling salesman. Dugan not only hunted the guy down, but he gave him a good working over. He then marched him, bruised and bloodied, down the street to the dance hall and forced him to return the money that he took from the girls. No word on whether or not Dugan received house credit for this good deed. Now that salesman would end up pressing charges over in Leadville. The judge not only found Dugan guilty of assault, but he also fined him $10 and ordered him to pay the court fees. A verdict that Dugan did not take lying down. He demanded that the salesman pay the fine for him, and he told the judge to basically shove the court costs up his ass. I'm not sure how the judge responded, but the salesman was sufficiently frightened into dropping the charges altogether. Believe it or not, Dugan would actually return to Leadville later on that year and take a job as a police patrolman. And once again, despite the change in times, he continued dishing out frontier justice. Per historian Robert D. Arment, quote, "If Leadville had discarded much of its wild roughness, Mart Duggan did not. He was constantly in trouble because of the heavy-handed approach to law enforcement that had served him well in earlier times and had brought him local fame and respect." End of quote. Dugan was fined again in March of 1888 after roughing up yet another traveling salesman. And this time he was fined a whopping $25. A turn of events that led to Dugan resigning from the police force and going on an extended bender. Hell, he was still drinking 2 weeks later when he got into a heated argument inside a gambling joint there in Leadville. For whatever reason, he had taken to verbally harassing one of the faro dealers. And when the establishment's owner, Bailey Youngson, intervened, Dugan invited the both of them to step outside and settle things like gentlemen. A challenge that they immediately declined. Worth noting that this was around 4 o'clock in the morning, so I'm next to certain that Dugan was fully 3 sheets to the wind. Nevertheless, several of his buddies were able to calm him down and convince him to go home and sleep it off. Dugan agreed and staggered outside, or at least he tried to. Only made it a few steps outside the door when someone slipped up behind and shot him in the back of the head. Miraculously, he would remain alive for the next 7 hours. He came to around about sunup and asked for a drink of water. When the deputies inquired as to the identity of his killer, Dugan replied that it was the aforementioned Bailey Youngson, before once again losing consciousness. When he awakened later on, he was once more questioned by authorities. This time he simply stated that he had been struck down by, quote-unquote, one of the gang. And when the police asked if it was Bailey Youngson, Dugan said no, and that he'd die before he'd ever tell them. And those were Martin Dugan's last words. He gave up the ghost later on that morning at just 39 years of age. Believe it or not, it was 10 years to the day that he had originally pinned on that Marshal's badge. The saloon owner Youngson was arrested, so was the faro dealer, but they were cleared of all charges. It wasn't until years later that the true killer was possibly revealed. Turns out it was most likely another faro dealer named George Evans, and it didn't have anything to do with Dugan harassing that other dealer. According to Robert D. Arment, quote, "Those professing to be in the know claimed that Evans was paid to murder the former Marshal by a group who held old grudges against him. Evans left Colorado soon after his release and went on a tour of Mexico and Central America, reportedly funded by those unnamed enemies of Dugan." End of quote. Evans was eventually killed in a gunfight down in South America in 1902, and when news reached Colorado, that's when people began opening up about his role in Dugan's murder. Now, Dugan's funeral was held in Denver. He was buried at the Riverside Cemetery in an unmarked grave, thus depriving Widow Lamb from dancing on it. She did allegedly do a jig on the blood-soaked sidewalk where he was shot, though. She also left her widow weeds on Mrs. Dugan's doorstep. Wasn't until 2005 that Martin finally received a gravestone. Apparently, a group of history aficionados there in Denver raised over $2,000 for it. Per the group's organizer, Gail Lindley, quote, "This guy is an unsung hero. He really transformed a depraved Leadville. He brought law and order to a lawless town. As a fallen officer, he deserves the honor and respect of a memorial stone." End of quote. And yeah, that's about all I've got on Martin J. Dugan. Much shorter episode than usual today. Just thought I'd share this story with you. Hopefully you found it as interesting as I did. And I hope you'll join me next week when we take a look at another mostly forgotten gunslinger by the name of Whisperin' Jim Smith. You might recognize that name if you ever saw 1948's Whisperin' Smith, starring Alan Ladd, or maybe the short-lived series with Audie Murphy. Both of these productions were very loosely based on the real-life Smith, who, like I said, we'll be covering next week. And trust me when I say he was nothing like Audie Murphy or Alan Ladd. And he would end up dying what I think is probably one of the most painful deaths I've ever shared here on the podcast. So until then, try not to pick a fight with a faro dealer, okay? Don't go pistol whipping no bartenders, blink as much as you possibly can, and please, whatever you do, don't go getting your load on in Leadville, Colorado. Alright, till next week, adios.